Thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, as I said at the beginning. And as you know, I'm not from an English-speaking country, so English is my third language, so I apologize for the many mistakes that you hear during this talk. So cut me some slack, as the Americans say. And before we talk about this topic that is very dear to my heart, which is inflammation, I always like to thank the people who helped me, and also I start to thank you. And in Portuguese, thank you is obrigado. So obrigado to all of you for being here to listen until the end. And obrigado to the organizers of this meeting, especially Daryl and my good friend, Professor Linda Fraceto, for inviting me once more and giving me the opportunity to participate in this. I also like to thank all of these people who helped me directly or indirectly to understand more about chronic inflammation from an evolutionary perspective. All of them helped me in this way. And I, of course, have to thank them for this. Professor Fritz Mosquito was supposed to be here. Unfortunately, his wife suffered a stroke and he wasn't able to come. Obviously, he has to take care of his dear wife. So I think you would be also fascinated to hear him, but unfortunately it was not possible this time. But I would like to appreciate all the help he has given me over the years. He's like a mentor to me. Also, my good friend Alejandro Lucia, he also helped me a lot to understand the role of exercise in chronic inflammation. And last, but certainly not least, I would like to thank and honor and dedicate this lecture to my dear friend, mentor, and supervisor that unfortunately passed away in 2016, and many of us here know his work, and I think many of us here were very, very sad and disturbed to hear about this terrible loss to this field. So I would like to dedicate this lecture to him. And what is exactly this lecture? Inflammation. What is inflammation? It's a very broad concept and it's a little hard to explain it in a very simple way, but I'm trying to do so. And to do so, I try to bring a few images and schemes that could help us understand this a little more. So here you are seeing below a tissue. So this is a tissue. This is a resident immune cell, in this case a macrophage. Here you have the endothelial cells. So this is the border between the tissue and this, which is a vase. So here you have a vase, and here you have the endothelial cells, and here you have a tissue composed of many cells, and one of those cells is an immune sentinel cell. In this case it's a macrophage because it's the most well-studied one, and because for the sake of time I decided to bring the one that everyone knows. And when you have a pro-inflammatory trigger, and in this case it doesn't matter if it's an inflammatory trigger derived from an injury, a torn meniscus, for instance, or if it's an inflammatory trigger derived from a bacterial infection, for instance. Just consider this an inflammatory trigger, whatever it is. And in this case, this will lead in the tissue, and you have an inflammatory trigger in the tissue, this will lead to the activation of these immune sentinel cells that will start to produce and secrete various molecules, especially cytokines, interleukin-1 beta and TNF-alpha. And these two cytokines will then go to the endothelial cells and will activate the endothelial cells. And then the endothelial cells will start to secrete these kind of molecules called adhesion molecules. And these adhesion molecules will allow immune cells that they are circulating in the blood at high speed with no brakes to adhere to the endothelial cells, and then from this adhesion, they can finally get inside the tissue. Why? Because the macrophage, when he sends out this signal, what he's doing is trying to alert other colleagues, in this case other immune cells, to help him do his job, which is to battle against this inflammatory trigger, which might be, as I said, an infectious trigger, or it might be a non-infectious trigger. In that case, the macrophage has to clear up all the cellular debris, so it has to clear up the garbage that results from that injury, and also it has to activate the regeneration process. So this is why this immune cell is secreting these molecules to alert other cells. And if the inflammatory trigger is more systemic or more exacerbated, what happens is that you will activate further on these endothelial cells to secrete more adhesion molecules, and this will allow, as I said, the other immune cells, in this case the neutrophil, to adhere to the endothelium cells, so to the endothelium, and from here this neutrophil can get inside the tissue to help the macrophage. But in order to do so, we know that certain cells, in this case the macrophage here and the endothelial cell there, they are going to also produce other molecules. These molecules are called prostaglandins, derived from arachidonic acid, an omega-6 fatty acid, and one of them, prostaglandin E2, will, along with other molecules secreted during this process, will increase endothelial permeability. And this will allow the neutrophil to enter the tissue, and when it enters the tissue, it will help the macrophage do its job. And another molecule produced and secreted by the macrophage and also by the endothelial cell and also by the neutrophil when it's activated, it's interleukin-6. And interleukin-6 goes to the liver, and this will lead to the production of acute phase reaction proteins such as C-reactive protein and fibrinogen, and also others like ferritin. But these two are the most well-known acute phase proteins, and this is the reason why I'm mentioning only those. And something that happens when you have an inflammatory reaction is that the neutrophils will release proteolytic enzymes. Those are very beneficial in case of a bacteria, for instance, but when they are released into the extracellular environment, they can cause damage to the tissue where the neutrophil is. Also, the neutrophil will produce reactive oxygen species, free radicals and others, and those will also cause harm to the tissue. They cause harm to a bacteria, but in case the inflammatory trigger is non-infectious, this will lead to tissue damage. And also we know that the macrophage also produces these molecules, reactive oxygen species, that will also cause harm to the tissue. So we know that acute inflammation is characterized by heat. Heat derives from the increased metabolic rate of all the cells involved in the inflammatory process. It also characterizes the acute inflammatory process redness, which results from increased vasodilation that is stimulated by prostaglandin E2 and by other molecules. Also, we have swelling. Swelling results from increased endothelial permeability, which will allow not only neutrophils to get into the tissue, but also liquids, so fluid, and proteins from plasma. And this will increase swelling in the tissue. And we also have pain, and pain results from the interaction of various molecules, and again prostaglandin E2 is also there, is one of the molecules involved, and this will lead to loss of function. So pain and loss of function is the main reason why people use NSAIDs, non-steroidal inflammatory drugs, and those drugs, they act mainly through the inhibition of an enzyme called COX-2, and that enzyme will lead to the production of prostaglandin E2 from arachidonic acid. So you see the role that arachidonic acid has in inflammation, in acute inflammation. So because of this, we all look at inflammation as a negative thing. So we all think that inflammation is very bad, so we should not have inflammation. But as you all know, of course, when there's evil, there's also good. And in this case, inflammation is absolutely necessary for life. Without inflammation, none of us would be here today. So inflammation is necessary in case of infections. It's also necessary in case of an injury because it activates the regeneration process in the tissues. So this means that without inflammation, you would get a lot of problems. So you need inflammation. In fact, you need an acute exacerbated inflammatory response. That's the normal physiological phenomenon. That's what should happen. So inflammation should begin, should be amplified, and then inflammation, when it's not necessary again, what should happen is that inflammation should resolve, should be extinguished. So a process called resolution of inflammation should happen. When you don't have the resolution of inflammation and inflammation continues, you get chronic inflammation. And when you get a high-grade chronic inflammation, normally it's what happens when you have diseases, such as chronic infectious diseases, autoimmune diseases, such as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, asthma, glomerulonephritis, and periodontitis. All of those diseases are characterized by high-grade chronic inflammation. But that's not what brought me here. In fact, what brought me here was an air buzz. But the reason I'm here today is to talk about low-grade chronic inflammation. So when inflammation doesn't resolve and it decreases its intensity, but it remains persistent. So it persists. It's chronic. When you have chronic inflammation, you can have problems on the long run. Not on the on a short-term period, but on the long run, you can have problems. So even this magazine, Time magazine, in 2004 talked about low-grade chronic inflammation as the silent killer. And indeed, there is data, accumulating data over the years, showing that low-grade chronic inflammation can lead to various problems. For instance, we know that chronic inflammation leads to insulin resistance. And this is very well established. It's not controversial at all. So insulin resistance is a cause of chronic inflammation. Of course, inflammation is not the only cause. Insulin resistance is caused by many factors, but one of them is chronic inflammation. And as you know, insulin resistance is the main underlying pathophysiological disturbance in metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome is characterized by dyslipidemia, by insulin resistance, by hyperglycemia, by elevated blood pressure, abdominal obesity, and is also characterized by high concentrations of uric acid, and, as I said, also by inflammation. So this is the metabolic syndrome that all of you know, and today it affects roughly 25% of the world population, of course, being different from one country to the other, and depending on age, on ethnicity, etc. But in total, we have, in my view, an epidemic of metabolic syndrome, which is something that could be prevented through lifestyle changes, as you all know. So, from the metabolic syndrome, you can get to diabetes, type 2 diabetes, well known, well recognized. But also we know that insulin resistance can also lead to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So we know that insulin resistance can lead to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and we know that once you get liver steatosis and you remain with an inflammatory load, a persistent inflammatory load, you can progress to steatohepatitis. So we know that once you have inflammation, you'll activate various immune cells, as we all mentioned, and those immune cells will produce various molecules, including cytokines and others, and those molecules will activate resident immune cells in the liver. And those cells, such as Kupffer cells, dendritic cells, and others, what they will do is that they will increase inflammation in the liver, and this can lead to steatohepatitis. So we can progress from simple steatosis to steatohepatitis, and from here we can progress to liver cancer. So inflammation is involved in all of these stages. Indirectly in case of steatosis by causing insulin resistance, and directly in this case in the progression to steatohepatitis. So besides the metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, we know that inflammation also leads to cardiovascular disease, mainly because it causes atherosclerosis. And you all seen Dr. Asim talk about atherosclerosis, cardiovascular disease, but let's look at this in a more deep way. A simplified version, but a little more deep. So let's look at atherosclerosis. Let's see what it is exactly. So here you have an arteria. So this is the arterial lumen. Here you have the tunica intima. Here you have the endothelial cells. And when you have an inflammatory trigger, as I said, doesn't matter if it's smoking or if it is a bad diet, doesn't matter now. When you have an inflammatory trigger, what happens is that these endothelial cells will produce and secrete various adhesion molecules. This will allow immune cells, such as the monocytes that are circulating in the arterial wall, to adhere to this endothelium. And from here, because inflammation increases endothelial permeability, this monocyte can enter the tissue, in this case the tunica intima of the arteria, where it will differentiate into macrophage. And if besides inflammation you also have dyslipidemia, so high concentration of various particles, not only LDLs but various others, but mostly LDL because that's the one that most of us know, but there are various other, like the remnant particles, for instance, VLDL, etc. So we have various particles that contain a protein called ApoB. All of those particles, if they remain in circulation for a long time, they can be atherogenic. So what happens is once you have these particles, a high number of particles, and especially when they are small and dense, they can get stuck in the intima, and also because the small dense LDL has much less vitamin E than the fluffy LDLs, they are more subject to oxidation by reactive oxygen species. And those reactive oxygen species in the intima, they can oxidize this small dense LDL, and then you get oxidized LDL. And oxidized LDL will be viewed by the immune system, in this case the macrophage, like something which is external to the body. This is a foreign agent. So this is an agent of destruction, so we need to kill it. So oxidized LDL will be phagocytized by the macrophage. So the macrophage now will internalize these these LDL. They are first small dense and now oxidized. And so the macrophage will get a lot of lipids inside. So we'll get the foam cells. And if you get a lot of foam cells, they will eventually enter into apoptosis because these cells don't live forever. And then you could get atherosclerotic plaque. So the formation of the atherosclerotic plaque results from three phenomena. First, dyslipidemia. Second, inflammation. Third, oxidative stress. So dyslipidemia is a player. So I don't agree with the notion that dyslipidemia is not a player, I'm sorry. But inflammation is also a player, and oxidative stress is also a player. We need the three of them in order to get atherosclerosis. And in fact, the Maasai have huge atherosclerosis, but they don't die from it. And I will show you why. So they have a high saturated fat intake, but they have huge atherosclerosis. Autopsy studies have been done in the 60s and the 70s by man, and he has shown that they have atherosclerosis. Advanced atherosclerosis, in fact. But they don't die from it. Why? They don't die from it because what happens is that when you get the atherosclerotic plaque, you get this, but this normally doesn't kill you. What happens is that when you get a plaque, you'll also have increased proliferation of vascular smooth muscle cells from the tunica media, and these cells will migrate to this area here to protect, to stabilize the plaque. So once you have stable plaques, like the Maasai do, normally you won't have too much of a problem. But if you have inflammation, all of these cytokines will increase. They will be produced by macrophages and other immune cells, and also by the endothelial cells that are activated in this process. And these cytokines will activate in the endothelial cells, the macrophages, and also these vascular smooth muscle cells, the production of molecules called metalloproteinases and cathepsins. So matrix metalloproteinases and cathepsins. And all of these molecules are proteolytic enzymes, so they can lead to the rupture of the plaque. And once you get a ruptured plaque, then you get into problems because you can get the formation of a thrombus, and then you can get a vascular accident, like a myocardial infarction or a stroke. So this means that you need dyslipidemia, but you also need inflammation. So both of them are necessary. And of course, oxidative stress is there in the middle. But these two are the most important ones. And in fact, we know that high concentrations of high sensitivity CRP, C-reactive protein, an acute phase protein, above 3, you have a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. And this has been shown in multiple cohort studies. And now you already have a few, not that many, but you already have a few randomized controlled trials showing that inflammation is a player in cardiovascular disease. So we know that inflammation is a big cause of cardiovascular disease, and we should, of course, pay more attention to it. Besides the metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease, we know that inflammation can also lead to various hormonal changes. We know that inflammation can also lead to depression. And how does inflammation lead to depression? Through various mechanisms, but one of them, which is the most well-studied and perhaps the easiest one to explain, is this one. So when this amino acid called tryptophan gets through the blood-brain barrier, gets in through the brain, what happens is tryptophan will be converted to other molecules, and eventually one of these molecules will be serotonin. As you all know, serotonin is a neurotransmitter and it's involved in depression. If you have inflammation, you'll get increased production of TNF-alpha, interferon gamma, and those two cytokines can lead to the upregulation of the expression of an enzyme called endoleamine dioxygenase, EDO. And this enzyme EDO will lead to the conversion of tryptophan not into serotonin but into kynurenine. And if you get more tryptophan into kynurenine, you get less tryptophan available to produce serotonin. So you could get depression through this mechanism, but of course it's not the only one. There are various ones. But this is one that's very well recognized. So we know that inflammation can also lead to depression. Then we know that neuroinflammation can lead to neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. We also know that it can compromise the nutritional status of various micronutrients. We know that inflammation can reduce iron status, zinc status, vitamin A status, vitamin B6 status, vitamin C, and also vitamin D. All of these micronutrients can have their status compromised when you have chronic inflammation through various mechanisms. Also, we know that chronic inflammation, besides this, can also lead to sarcopenia and to osteopenia. In fact, if you look at the muscle of a patient with rheumatoid arthritis and you compare it to a healthy young control, you see the difference. Not only it has less muscle, but it also has infiltration of lipids inside the muscle. And lipid infiltration inside the tissue can lead to lipotoxicity, true lipotoxicity, in this case to insulin resistance and to anabolic resistance. So you'd get a less anabolic response once you are subject to an anabolic stimulus, such as weight training, for instance. So inflammation can lead to sarcopenia. Also, we know that inflammation can lead to osteopenia and osteoporosis. For instance, women with rheumatoid arthritis have a much higher risk of hip fractures than women who do not have rheumatoid arthritis, and as you know, rheumatoid arthritis is a chronic inflammatory disease. Also, we know that inflammation can lead to immunosenescence, so this is involved in aging, as Linda Fraceto has mentioned before. So this means that your adaptive immune response will be compromised. So you have low-grade persistent inflammation, but when you have a real danger, when you really need to upregulate the expression of various molecules in your immune cells in order to battle, for instance, a virus or a bacteria, that doesn't happen effectively. And in this case, we already have studies, association studies, and of course they have their various limitations, but nonetheless, these studies suggest that when you have low-grade chronic inflammation, what happens is that your response to virus, to bacteria, and to vaccines is less effective. So what you should have is a very low level of inflammation, but when you need it, you should have an upregulation of the inflammatory response. Nowadays, what we have is persistent inflammation, but at this low level, when what we should have is this very low level, and when we need it, we should upregulate and then down again. That's what you see in some traditional societies, like the Shuar in Ecuador, for instance, that were studied by Thomas McDade a few years ago. And then also we know that chronic inflammation can lead to cancer, and Daryl has beautifully mentioned how inflammation can lead to cancer, and also he has mentioned one of the solutions, which is also related to what I'm saying, which is movement. So now that we've seen that inflammation is something that we should all pay attention to, we have to find out what is causing low-grade chronic inflammation. So we've presented the problem, let's look at the causes of the problem. First cause of the problem is pollution and smoking. And this is an obvious one, so there is no need to really go into this. And then we know that sleep disturbance can also lead to inflammation. For instance, we know that when people are sleep restricted, for instance, when they restrict in a controlled environment, human beings from 8 to 6 and 8 to 4 hours, what happens is that you see an increase in all of these inflammatory proteins, you see a decrease in insulin sensitivity, and you see a decrease in vasodilation. So we know that sleep is not a luxury, sleep is physiologically necessary for our health and well-being, and this is one of the reasons. And this means that you should, as I said at the beginning, cut me some slack, not only because I'm Portuguese, but also because I'm sleep deprived. And when you look at what Dan Pardy has also beautifully discussed before, you see that in the old days, we would have a lack of light in the evening, a lot of light during the day. Nowadays, you have an absence of light during the day, like we are having today, and we have excessive light during the night. And this will cause a disruption of the circadian rhythm, and will also change, of course, our sleep patterns. And we know from studies done in shift workers that a disruption of the circadian rhythm has many adverse consequences. We know that shift working is associated with increased risk for cardiovascular disease, cancer incidence, rheumatoid arthritis, autoimmune thyroid diseases, and all-cause mortality. So we know that sleep is really necessary, and we should have a circadian rhythm that is more in sync with the natural rhythm of day and night, and also, as Dan has mentioned before, the differences in temperature, which is something that today doesn't happen because we have AC, and this means that we can manipulate the temperature of our environment, and that's also something that could alter our sleep and circadian rhythm. Then we know that chronic stress can also lead to inflammation. There are various studies showing this, that stress can lead to, it has many consequences, but I would like to mention something that's not always appreciated, which is loneliness. And we know that loneliness is associated, and this is a meta-analysis of 35 studies, more than 77,000 people, with all-cause mortality. So this is something that we should also pay attention to, and when you look at traditional societies, many of them have a very good social network. This is something that could also affect our health and well-being. Then we know that physical inactivity, so if you see this here, this arrow here, it means physical inactivity. So Daryl has mentioned this, but I would like to mention the effect of not doing any movement. So in this study, what they've done is take people who are 70 years old and put them on a very low movement program. So they had to move less than 1,500 steps per day during 2 weeks. And what happened after 2 weeks was increase in inflammatory markers. For instance, CRP went up by 25% in just 2 weeks. Then we saw a decrease in postprandial insulin sensitivity by about 40%, and we saw a decrease in postprandial protein synthesis, so anabolic resistance. So physical inactivity is a problem, and it is a problem all over the world. And here in the United Kingdom, you see that more than 50% of women and more than 50% of men are inactive. They are sedentary. So this is, of course, a problem, and this is something that we should fight. And then we know that along the years, for instance, in this case, you see the average fast food meal size increasing 4 times. So we are more sedentary and we are eating much more. Of course, diet quality is really very important, and we'll mention it again, and it was mentioned today in various talks, but we also need to pay attention to something that in the past I didn't pay attention to, but I know that it's very important, which is energy balance. And nowadays we have an excessive energy balance. And so this can lead, we know that a hypercaloric diet not only has adverse effects because it can lead to obesity, but we know that a hypercaloric diet also has many other adverse effects because it can lead directly to inflammation. And we know that it can lead to obesity, and we know that obesity is also associated with inflammation, is a cause of inflammation. Here you have a systematic review with meta-analysis of 51 studies showing an association between elevated CRP and a high BMI. But much more important than looking at the total body weight is looking at the distribution of fat. And we know that you can have subcutaneous and visceral fat, and we know that visceral fat is much more damaging than subcutaneous fat. So here you see the infiltration of macrophages. Here you see a low infiltration of macrophages into the adipose tissue. This is the adipose tissue of someone who is insulin sensitive. It has mainly subcutaneous, and he's someone who has mostly visceral fat. So visceral fat is something that we should all pay attention to much more. And indeed, we know that this is a cause of inflammation, and it's something that's very well established. Then, moving on from energy balance, physical inactivity, and all these lifestyle-related factors that we mentioned, let's talk a little bit about diet quality. We know that, for instance, the ingestion of the consumption of advanced glycation end products and advanced lipooxidation end products that exist in these types of foods, fried foods, for instance, we know that they can have, of course, various adverse effects, but one of them is to increase inflammation. And in this study, during 28 days, these people ate 160 grams of potato chips. And after 28 days, you see an increase in EL6, C-reactive protein, oxidized LDL, and this marker of oxidative stress, which is gamma GT. So we see an increase in inflammation, an increase in oxidative stress with just 160 grams of potato chips during 1 month. Then we know that oxidative stress that can result from the consumption of these foods that contain these compounds is a cause of inflammation. And in this scenario, I would like to mention something that is rarely mentioned, unfortunately, which is linoleic acid. We know that a high increase of linoleic acid could lead to oxidative stress, and that could lead to inflammation. And we know that linoleic acid decreases total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, and also improves the total cholesterol to HDL cholesterol ratio. Nevertheless, as Dr. Assim has mentioned today, we know that a high intake of linoleic acid doesn't decrease the risk for mortality in cardiovascular disease patients. And one of the reasons is this, because it can cause oxidative stress, it can lead to the oxidation of LDL. Then we know that consumption of high glycemic load foods can also lead to inflammation. And in this study, what they've done is to give water with an artificial sweetener or water with 75 grams of glucose. And after 3 hours, they measured the activity of a transcription factor involved in inflammation called NF-kappa-B, nuclear factor kappa-B. And they saw that it went up 3 hours in mononuclear cells, which are lymphocytes and monocytes, when they ingested water with glucose compared to water with an artificial sweetener. Also, when you compare white bread to glucose, the same amount of carbs, 50 grams, during a 3-hour period, you see that there is no statistically significant difference between one or the other in terms of elevating the activity of NF-kappa-B in these cells in human beings. So this is a study done in humans. So we know that these types of foods, of course, have adverse effects. There is a lot of controversy around the glycemic index, the glycemic load. Nevertheless, it seems that they can trigger inflammation. Then we know that the consumption of trans fatty acids and some saturated fatty acids can also lead to inflammation. And I'm mainly concerned about processed and ultra-processed foods. Also, we know that a high salt diet can also lead to inflammation. So we know this from various studies. And the first one that I'm aware of was published in 2013 in this unknown journal called Nature. So a high salt diet can lead also to inflammation. Then we know that the consumption of fast food meals, of course, leads to inflammation. Here we have a study that shows this. This is a study in non-diabetic individuals with normal weight that ingested 1 egg and sausage muffin and 2 hash browns. These 910 kilocalories. And after 3 hours, you see an increase in the activity of NF-κB in the nucleus of these mononuclear cells of 150% compared to baseline after 3 hours. So this leads to an increased pro-inflammatory gene expression. Why? Mainly because these fast food meals are hypercaloric. They have trans fatty acids or palmitic acids. You know that palm oil is being used to replace trans fatty acids. Oxidized lipids, advanced glycation end products. Sometimes they can have a high glycemic load, and many times they have a high content of salt. All of these can lead to inflammation. I think this is important, especially given that many people nowadays are following this. If it fits your macros, if you only pay attention to your energy balance, then you can eat whatever you want because your body composition is going to be great. And it's true to a certain point, but you are forgetting the long-term effects of this in your health. Then we know that deficiency of nutrients like magnesium, zinc, and selenium can also have an impact on inflammation. We know that the deficiency of these nutrients can lead to inflammation. And in this case, we have this study done in Brazil with more than 32,000 people, where it was shown that they eat a lot of foods that are processed and ultra-processed. And a high intake of ultra-processed foods, we know that it is associated with a lower intake of zinc, magnesium, and selenium. And in fact, this study has been published a few weeks ago, showing that in this cohort of almost 20,000 individuals, that if you eat a high ultra-processed diet, you increase mortality. In fact, more than 4 servings a day increase mortality by more than 60%. So this is something that we should also pay attention to. And then we know that the deficiency of vitamin D can also lead to inflammation. So deficiency of vitamin D, why it is epidemic today? Perhaps because many of us are following up on these recommendations by these good guys, saying these things that everyone nowadays is following. So if we do not take the sun, there's no way we are going to get enough vitamin D unless you take a supplement, of course. But that was not nature's way. Nature's way for a long time was to synthesize it in your skin when you're exposed to UVB radiation. Then we know that a decrease in microbial gene richness, so a decrease in the diversity of your microbiota, is also a promoter of inflammation. And this results from the fact that in the past we are exposed to the elements. Today we are not exposed to the elements, and we are very hygienized. And also because many of us are abusing antibiotics. I'm not against antibiotics, of course I'm not. I'm very in favor of modern medicine, it saves lives. But the abuse of antibiotics can have many adverse effects, and one of them is to decrease the diversity of your microbiota. And then, because if your diet is like this, you will have less available material for your bacteria in your gut to proliferate. And this explains why the Yanomami in the Amazon jungle, they have much higher microbial diversity compared, for instance, to Americans. And in my view, this explains a lot of things. And here you see also an increased microbial diversity in skin samples in the Yanomami. So it's not just the gut, it's your whole body. And this results from a lack of exposure to the elements, and it results to the overuse of modern antibiotics that decreases microbiota richness and can lead to chronic inflammation, allergic diseases, and also autoimmune diseases. So, as we've seen, physical inactivity, obesity, the Western diet, dysbiosis chronic stress, disturbed sleep, pollution and smoking, all of that can lead to low-grade chronic inflammation. And through that, you can have all of these things that we mentioned before. So this means that chronic inflammation is caused by what many people today are calling the exposome, the modern exposome. All of the exposures that you encounter throughout your lifetime. And this includes also physical activity. So all of this is related to your lifestyle. So this means that there is a solution. And what is the solution to our problem? So the solution to our problem is not to come back to where we were before, but I think the solution to our problem is to adopt, at least to a certain extent, all of these things that I've included here. So movement, as Daryl has beautifully mentioned, adequate body composition is something that we should all aim for. Decrease or eliminate fast food from your diet. Eat a more traditional diet. This will, of course, help in terms of having a diversified microbiota. In certain cases, we know that certain bioactive compounds that exist in fruits and vegetables, and Dr. Emily Deans has mentioned this, they act through hormesis. So they are like a slightly low-level stressor that will elicit an adaptive response. That adaptive response is an increase in the expression of various antioxidant proteins and also a decrease in the expression of various inflammatory proteins. So we know that various phytochemicals that exist in fruits and vegetables can affect inflammation. So this is a way that we could also use these foods. Then we should pay attention to the intake of omega-3 fatty acids, as Professor Michael Crawford has mentioned today. We should get adequate sleep, we should get sun exposure, we should get more exposure also to green spaces and to the elements, and we should aim to reduce our stress levels and to maintain a positive attitude even when people criticize you, such as this one.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I've ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. God have mercy on your soul.
Unfortunately, we have to face these types of criticisms, and I try to follow, and it's not easy sometimes, but I try to follow what Shakespeare once said a long time ago: love all, trust a few, do wrong to none. Thank you very much. Obrigado.